hung heavily, and there was a rawness in the air that suggested snow. A woman servant came into the room in which a child was sleeping and drew the curtains. She glanced mechanically at the house opposite, a stucco house with a portico, and went to the child's bed. "Wake up, Philip," she said. She pulled down the bedclothes, took him in her arms, and carried him downstairs. He was only half awake. "Your mother wants you," she said. She opened the door of a room on the floor below and took the child over to a bed in which a woman was lying. It was his mother. She stretched out her arms, and the child nestled by her side. He did not ask why he had been awakened. The woman kissed his eyes, and with thin, small hands felt the warm body through his white flannel nightgown. She pressed him closer to herself. "Are you sleepy, darling?" she said. Her voice was so weak that it seemed to come already from a great distance. The child did not answer, but smiled comfortably. He was very happy in the large, warm bed, with those soft arms about him. He tried to make himself smaller still as he cuddled up against his mother, and he kissed her sleepily. In a moment he closed his eyes and was fast asleep. The doctor came forwards and stood by the bedside. "Oh, don't take him away yet," she moaned. The doctor, without answering, looked at her gravely. Knowing she would not be allowed to keep the child much longer, the woman kissed him again, and she passed her hand down his body till she came to his feet. She held the right foot in her hand and felt the 5 small toes, and then slowly passed her hand over the left one. She gave a sob. "What's the matter?" said the doctor. "You're tired." She shook her head, unable to speak, and the tears rolled down her cheeks. The doctor bent down. "Let me take him." She was too weak to resist his wish, and she gave the child up. The doctor handed him back to his nurse. "You'd better put him back in his own bed." "Very well, sir." The little boy, still sleeping, was taken away. His mother sobbed now, broken-heartedly. "What will happen to him, poor child?" The monthly nurse tried to quiet her, and presently, from exhaustion, the crying ceased. The doctor walked to a table on the other side of the room, upon which, under a towel, lay the body of a stillborn child. He lifted the towel and looked. He was hidden from the bed by a screen, but the woman guessed what he was doing. "Was it a girl or a boy?" she whispered to the nurse. "Another boy." The woman did not answer. In a moment the child's nurse came back. She approached the bed. "Master Philip never woke up," she said. There was a pause, then the doctor felt his patient's pulse once more. "I don't think there's anything I can do just now," he said. "I'll call again after breakfast." "I'll show you out, sir," said the child's nurse. They walked downstairs in silence. In the hall the doctor stopped. "You've sent for Mrs. Carey's brother-in-law, haven't you?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know at what time he'll be here?" "No, sir. I'm expecting a telegram." "What about the little boy? I should think he'd be better out of the way." "Miss Watkins said she'd take him, sir." "Who's she?" "She's his godmother, sir. Do you think Mrs. Carey will get over it, sir?" The doctor shook his head. Chapter 2. It was a week later. Philip was sitting on the floor in the drawing-room at Miss Watkins's house in Onslow Gardens. He was an only child and used to amusing himself. The room was filled with massive furniture, and on each of the sofas were 3 big cushions. There was a cushion, too, in each armchair. All these he had taken out, and, with the help of the gilt-rout chairs, light and easy to move, had made an elaborate cave in which he could hide himself from the Red Indians who were lurking behind the curtains. He put his ear to the floor and listened to the herd of buffaloes that raced across the prairie. Presently, hearing the door open, he held his breath so that he might not be discovered. But a violent hand piled away a chair, and the cushions fell down. "You naughty boy! Miss Watkin will be cross with you." "Hullo, Emma," he said. The nurse bent down and kissed him, then began to shake out the cushions and put them back in their places. "Am I to come home?" he asked. "Yes, I've come to fetch you." "You've got a new dress on." It was in 1885, and she wore a bustle. Her gown was of black velvet, with tight sleeves and sloping shoulders, and the skirt had 3 large flounces. She wore a black bonnet with velvet strings. She hesitated. The question she had expected did not come, and so she could not give the answer she had prepared. "Aren't you going to ask how your mamma is?" she said at length. "Oh, I forgot. How is mamma?" Now she was ready. "Your mamma is quite well and happy." "Oh, I am glad." "Your mamma's gone away. You won't ever see her any more." Philip did not know what she meant. "Why not?" "Your mamma's in heaven." She began to cry, and Philip, though he did not quite understand, cried too. Emma was a tall, big-boned woman with fair hair and large features. She came from Devonshire, and, notwithstanding her many years of service in London, had never lost the breadth of her accent. Her tears increased her emotion, and she pressed the little boy to her heart. She felt vaguely the pity of that child deprived of the only love in the world that is quite unselfish. It seemed dreadful that he must be handed over to strangers. But in a little while she pulled herself together. "Your Uncle William is waiting in to see you," she said. "Go and say good-bye to Miss Watkin, and we'll go home." "I don't want to say good-bye," he answered, instinctively anxious to hide his tears. "Very well. Run upstairs and get your hat." He fetched it, and when he came down Emma was waiting for him in the hall. He heard the sound of voices in the study behind the dining room. He paused. He knew that Miss Watkin and her sister were talking to friends, and it seemed to him, he was 9 years old, that if he went in they would be sorry for him. "I think I'll go and say good-bye to Miss Watkin." "I think you'd better," said Emma. "Go in and tell them I'm coming," he said. He wished to make the most of his opportunity. Emma knocked at the door and walked in. He heard her speak. "Master Philip wants to say good-bye to you, miss." There was a sudden hush of the conversation, and Philip limped in. Henrietta Watkin was a stout woman with a red face and dyed hair. In those days to dye the hair excited comment, and Philip had heard much gossip at home when his godmothers changed colour. She lived with an elder sister who had resigned herself contentedly to old age. Two ladies whom Philip did not know were calling, and they looked at him curiously. "My poor child," said Miss Watkin, opening her arms. She began to cry. Philip understood now why she had not been in to luncheon, and why she wore a black dress. She could not speak. "I've got to go home," said Philip at last. He disengaged himself from Miss Watkin's arms, and she kissed him again. Then he went to her sister and bade her good-bye too. One of the strange ladies asked if she might kiss him, and he gravely gave her permission. Though crying, he keenly enjoyed the sensation he was causing. He would have been glad to stay a little longer, to be made much of, but felt they expected him to go, so he said that Emma was waiting for him. He went out of the room. Emma had gone downstairs to speak with a friend in the basement, and he waited for her on the landing. He heard Henrietta Watkin's voice. "His mother was my greatest friend. I can't bear to think that she's dead." "You oughtn't to have gone to the funeral, Henrietta," said her sister. "I knew it would upset you." Then one of the strangers spoke. "Poor little boy. It's dreadful to think of him quite alone in the world. I see he limps." "Yes, he's got a club foot. It was such a grief to his mother." Then Emma came back. They called a hansom, and she told the driver where to go. Chapter 3. When they reached the house Mrs. Carey had died in, it was in a dreary, respectable street between Notting Hill Gate and High Street, Kensington. Emma led Philip into the drawing-room. His uncle was writing letters of thanks for the wreaths which had been sent. One of them, which had arrived too late for the funeral, lay in its cardboard box on the hall table. "Here's Master Philip," said Emma. Mr. Carey stood up slowly and shook hands with the little boy. Then, on second thoughts, he bent down and kissed his forehead. He was a man of somewhat less than average height, inclined to corpulence, with his hair, worn long, arranged over the scalp so as to conceal his baldness. He was clean-shaven. His features were regular, and it was possible to imagine that in his youth he had been good-looking. On his watch-chain he wore a gold cross. "You're going to live with me now, Philip," said Mr. Carey. "Shall you like that?" 2 years before, Philip had been sent down to stay at the vicarage after an attack of chicken-pox, but there remained with him a recollection of an attic and a large garden rather than of his uncle and aunt. "Yes, you must look upon me and your Aunt Louisa as your father and mother." The child's mouth trembled a little. He reddened, but did not answer. "Your dear mother left you in my charge." Mr. Carey had no great ease in expressing himself. When the news came that his sister-in-law was dying, he set off at once for London, but on the way thought of nothing but the disturbance in his life that would be caused if her death forced him to undertake the care of her son. He was well over 50, and his wife, to whom he had been married for 30 years, was childless. He did not look forward with any pleasure to the presence of a small boy who might be noisy and rough. He had never much liked his sister-in-law. "I'm going to take you down to Blackstable to-morrow," he said. "With Emma?" The child put his hand in hers, and she pressed it. "I'm afraid Emma must go away," said Mr. Carey. "But I want Emma to come with me." Philip began to cry, and the nurse could not help crying too. Mr. Carey looked at them helplessly. "I think you'd better leave me alone with Master Philip for a moment." "Very good, sir." Though Philip clung to her, she released herself gently. Mr. Carey took the boy on his knee and put his arm round him. "You mustn't cry," he said. "You're too old to have a nurse now. We must see about sending you to school." "I want Emma to come with me," the child repeated. "It costs too much money, Philip. Your father didn't leave very much, and I don't know what's become of it. You must look at every penny you spend." Mr. Carey had called the day before on the family solicitor. Philip's father was a surgeon in good practice, and his hospital appointments suggested an established position, so that it was a surprise on his sudden death from blood poisoning to find that he had left his widow little more than his life insurance and what could be got for the lease of their house in Bruton Street. This was 6 months ago, and Mrs. Carey, already in delicate health, finding herself with child, had lost her head and accepted for the lease the first offer that was made. She stored her furniture, and, at a rent which the person thought outrageous, took a furnished house for a year, so that she might suffer from no inconvenience till her child was born. But she had never been used to the management of money, and was unable to adapt her expenditure to her altered circumstances. The little she had slipped through her fingers in one way or another, so that now, when all expenses were paid, not much more than £2,000 remained to support the boy till he was able to earn his own living. It was impossible to explain all this to Philip, and he was sobbing still. "You'd better go to Emma," Mr. Carey said, feeling that she could console the child better than anyone. Without a word, Philip slipped off his uncle's knee, but Mr. Carey stopped him. "We must go to-morrow, because on Saturday I've got to prepare my sermon, and you must tell Emma to get your things ready to-day. You can bring all your toys, and if you want anything to remember your father and mother by, you can take one thing for each of them. Everything else is going to be sold." The boy slipped out of the room. Mr. Carey was unused to work, and he turned to his correspondence with resentment. On one side of the desk was a bundle of bills, and these filled him with irritation. One especially seemed preposterous. Immediately after Mrs. Carey's death, Emma had ordered from the florist masses of white flowers for the room in which the dead woman lay. It was sheer waste of money. Emma took far too much upon herself. Even if there had been no financial necessity, he would have dismissed her. But Philip went to her and hid his face in her bosom and wept as though his heart would break. And she, feeling that he was almost her own son, she had taken him when he was a month old, consoled him with soft words. She promised that she would come and see him sometimes, and that she would never forget him. And she told him about the country he was going to, and about her own home in Devonshire. Her father kept a turnpike on the high road that led to Exeter, and there were pigs in the sty, and there was a cow, and the cow had just had a calf, till Philip forgot his tears and grew excited at the thought of his approaching journey. Presently she put him down, for there was much to be done, and he helped her to lay out his clothes on the bed. She sent him into the nursery to gather up his toys, and in a little while he was playing happily. But at last he grew tired of being alone and went back to the bedroom, in which Emma was now putting his things into a big tin box. He remembered then that his uncle had said he might take something to remember his father and mother by. He told Emma, and asked her what he should take. "You'd better go into the drawing-room and see what you fancy. Uncle William's there." "Never mind that. They're your own things now." Philip went downstairs slowly and found the door open. Mr. Carey had left the room. Philip walked slowly round. They had been in the house so short a time that there was little in it that had a particular interest to him. It was a stranger's room, and Philip saw nothing that struck his fancy. But he knew which were his mother's things and which belonged to the landlord, and presently fixed on a little clock that he had once heard his mother say she liked. With this he walked rather disconsolately upstairs. Outside the door of his mother's bedroom he stopped and listened. Though no one had told him not to go in, he had a feeling it would be wrong to do so. He was a little frightened, and his heart beat uncomfortably, but at the same time something impelled him to turn the handle. He turned it very gently, as if to prevent anyone within from hearing, and then slowly pushed the door open. He stood on the threshold for a moment before he had the courage to enter. He was not frightened now, but it seemed strange. He closed the door behind him. The blinds were drawn, and the room, in the cold light of a January afternoon, was dark. On the dressing-table were Mrs. Carey's brushes and a hand mirror. In a little tray were hairpins. There was a photograph of himself on the chimney-piece, and one of his father. He had often been in the room when his mother was not in it, but now it seemed different. There was something curious in the look of the chairs. The bed was made as though some one were going to sleep in it that night, and in a case on the pillow was a night-dress. Philip opened a large cupboard filled with dresses, and stepping in, took as many of them as he could in his arms, and buried his face in them. They smelt of the scent his mother used. Then he opened the drawers filled with his mother's things, and looked at them. There were lavender bags among the linen, and their scent was fresh and pleasant. The strangeness of the room left it, and it seemed to him that his mother had just gone out for a walk. She would be in presently, and would come upstairs to have nursery tea with him, and he seemed to feel her kiss on his lips. It was not true that he would never see her again. It was not true simply because it was impossible. He climbed up on the bed and put his head on the pillow. He lay there quite still. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Philip parted from Emma with tears, but the journey to Blackstable amused him, and when they arrived he was resigned and cheerful. Blackstable was 60 miles from London. Giving their luggage to a porter, Mr. Carey set out to walk with Philip to the vicarage. It took them little more than 5 minutes, and when they reached it, Philip suddenly remembered the gate. It was red and 5-barred. It swung both ways on easy hinges, and it was possible, though forbidden, to swing backwards and forwards on it. They walked through the garden to the front door. This was only used by visitors and on Sundays and on special occasions, as when the vicar went up to London or came back. The traffic of the house took place through a side door, and there was a back door as well for the gardener and for beggars and tramps. It was a fairly large house of yellow brick with a red roof, built about 25 years before in an ecclesiastical style. The front door was like a church porch, and the drawing-room windows were Gothic. Mrs. Carey, knowing by what train they were coming, waited in the drawing-room and listened for the click of the gate. When she heard it, she went to the door. "There's Aunt Louisa," said Mr. Carey when he saw her. "Run and give her a kiss." Philip started to run, awkwardly trailing his club foot, and then stopped. Mrs. Carey was a little shriveled woman of the same age as her husband, with a face extraordinarily filled with deep wrinkles and pale blue eyes. Her gray hair was arranged in ringlets according to the fashion of her youth. She wore a black dress, and her only ornament was a gold chain from which hung a cross. She had a shy manner and a gentle voice. "Did you walk, William?" she said almost reproachfully as she kissed her husband. "I didn't think of it," he answered, with a glance at his nephew. "It didn't hurt you to walk, Philip, did it?" she asked the child. "No, I always walk." He was a little surprised at their conversation. Aunt Louisa told him to come in, and they entered the hall. It was paved with red and yellow tiles, on which alternately were a Greek cross and the Lamb of God. An imposing staircase led out of the hall. It was of polished pine, with a peculiar smell, and had been put in because, fortunately, when the church was reseated, enough wood remained over. The balusters were decorated with emblems of the 4 evangelists. "I've had the stove lighted, as I thought you'd be cold after your journey," said Mrs. Carey. It was a large black stove that stood in the hall, and was only lighted if the weather was very bad and the vicar had a cold. It was not lighted if Mrs. Carey had a cold. Coal was expensive. Besides, Mary Ann, the maid, didn't like fires all over the place. If they wanted all them fires, they must keep a second girl. In the winter Mr. and Mrs. Carey lived in the dining-room, so that one fire should do, and in the summer they could not get out of the habit, so the drawing-room was used only by Mr. Carey on Sunday afternoons for his nap. But every Saturday he had a fire in the study, so that he could write his sermon. Aunt Louisa took Philip upstairs and showed him into a tiny bedroom that looked out on the drive. Immediately in front of the window was a large tree, which Philip remembered now because the branches were so low that it was possible to climb quite high up it. "A small room for a small boy," said Mrs. Carey. "You won't be frightened at sleeping alone?" "Oh, no." On his first visit to the vicarage he had come with his nurse, and Mrs. Carey had had little to do with him. She looked at him now with some uncertainty. "Can you wash your own hands, or shall I wash them for you?" "I can wash myself," he answered firmly. "Well, I shall look at them when you come down to tea," said Mrs. Carey. She knew nothing about children. After it was settled that Philip should come down to Blackstable, Mrs. Carey had thought much how she should treat him. She was anxious to do her duty, but now he was there she found herself just as shy of him as he was of her. She hoped he would not be noisy and rough, because her husband did not like rough and noisy boys. Mrs. Carey made an excuse to leave Philip alone, but in a moment came back and knocked at the door. She asked him, without coming in, if he could pour out the water himself. Then she went downstairs and rang the bell for tea. The dining-room, large and well proportioned, had windows on 2 sides of it, with heavy curtains of red rep. There was a big table in the middle, and at one end an imposing mahogany sideboard with a looking-glass in it. In one corner stood a harmonium. On each side of the fireplace were chairs covered in stamped leather, each with an antimacassar. One had arms and was called the husband, and the other had none and was called the wife. Mrs. Carey never sat in the armchair. She said she preferred a chair that was not too comfortable. There was always lots to do, and if her chair had had arms, she might not be so ready to leave it. Mr. Carey was making up the fire when Philip came in, and he pointed out to his nephew that there were two pokers. One was large and bright and polished and unused, and was called the Vicar, and the other, which was much smaller and had evidently passed through many fires, was called the Curate. "What are we waiting for?" said Mr. Carey. "I told Mary Ann to make you an egg. I thought you'd be hungry after your journey." Mrs. Carey thought the journey from London to Blackstable very tiring. She seldom travelled herself, for the living was only $300 a year, and when her husband wanted a holiday, since there was not money for two, he went by himself. He was very fond of church congresses, and usually managed to go up to London once a year, and once he had been to Paris for the exhibition, and 2 or 3 times to Switzerland. Mary Ann brought in the egg, and they sat down. The chair was much too low for Philip, and for a moment neither Mr. Carey nor his wife knew what to do. "I'll put some books under him," said Mary Ann. She took from the top of the harmonium the large Bible and the prayer book from which the vicar was accustomed to read prayers, and put them on Philip's chair. "Oh, William, he can't sit on the Bible," said Mrs. Carey in a shocked tone. "Can't you get him some books out of the study?" Mr. Carey considered the question for an instant. "I don't think it matters this once if you put the prayer book on the top, Mary Ann," he said. "The Book of Common Prayer is the composition of men like ourselves. It has no claim to divine authorship." "I hadn't thought of that, William," said Aunt Louisa. Philip perched himself on the books, and the vicar, having said grace, cut the top off his egg. "There," he said, handing it to Philip. "You can eat my top if you like." Philip would have liked an egg to himself, but he was not offered one, so took what he could. "How have the chickens been laying since I went away?" asked the vicar. "Oh, they've been dreadful. Only 1 or 2 a day." "How do you like that top, Philip?" asked his uncle. "Very much, thank you." "You shall have another on Sunday afternoon." Mr. Carey always had a boiled egg at tea on Sunday, so that he might be fortified for the evening service. Chapter 5. Philip came gradually to know the people he was to live with, and by fragments of conversation, some of it not meant for his ears, learned a good deal both about himself and about his dead parents. Philip's father had been much younger than the vicar of Blackstable. After a brilliant career at St. Luke's Hospital, he was put on the staff and presently began to earn money in considerable sums. He spent it freely. When the parson set about restoring his church and asked his brother for a subscription, he was surprised by receiving a couple of £100. Mr. Carey, thrifty by inclination and economical by necessity, accepted it with mingled feelings. He was envious of his brother because he could afford to give so much, pleased for the sake of his church, and vaguely irritated by a generosity which seemed almost ostentatious. Then Henry Carey married a patient, a beautiful girl but penniless, an orphan with no near relations, but of good family, and there was an array of fine friends at the wedding. The parson, on his visits to her when he came to London, held himself with reserve. He felt shy with her, and in his heart he resented her great beauty. She dressed more magnificently than became the wife of a hard-working surgeon, and the charming furniture of her house, the flowers among which she lived even in winter, suggested an extravagance which he deplored. He heard her talk of entertainments she was going to, and, as he told his wife on getting home again, it was impossible to accept hospitality without making some return. He had seen grapes in the dining-room that must have cost at least 8 shillings a pound, and at luncheon he had been given asparagus 2 months before it was ready in the vicarage garden. Now all he had anticipated was come to pass. The vicar felt the satisfaction of the prophet who saw fire and brimstone consume the city which would not mend its way to his warning. Poor Philip was practically penniless, and what was the good of his mother's fine friends now? He heard that his father's extravagance was really criminal, and it was a mercy that Providence had seen fit to take his dear mother to itself. She had no more idea of money than a child. When Philip had been a week at Blackstable, an incident happened which seemed to irritate his uncle very much. One morning he found on the breakfast table a small packet which had been sent on by post from the late Mrs. Carey's house in London. It was addressed to her. When the parson opened it, he found a dozen photographs of Mrs. Carey. They showed the head and shoulders only, and her hair was more plainly done than usual, low on the forehead, which gave her an unusual look. The face was thin and worn, but no illness could impair the beauty of her features. There was in the large dark eyes a sadness which Philip did not remember. The first sight of the dead woman gave Mr. Carey a little shock, but this was quickly followed by perplexity. The photographs seemed quite recent, and he could not imagine who had ordered them. "Do you know anything about these, Philip?" he asked. "I remember mamma said she'd been taken," he answered. "Miss Watkins scolded her. She said I wanted the boy to have something to remember me by when he grows up." Mr. Carey looked at Philip for an instant. The child spoke in a clear treble. He recalled the words, but they meant nothing to him. "You'd better take one of the photographs and keep it in your room," said Mr. Carey. "I'll put the others away." He sent one to Miss Watkin, and she wrote and explained how they came to be taken. One day Mrs. Carey was lying in bed, but she was feeling a little better than usual, and the doctor in the morning had seemed hopeful. Emma had taken the child out, and the maids were downstairs in the basement. Suddenly Mrs. Carey felt desperately alone in the world. A great fear seized her that she would not recover from the confinement which she was expecting in a fortnight. Her son was 9 years old. How could he be expected to remember her? She could not bear to think that he would grow up and forget her utterly. And she had loved him so passionately because he was weakly and deformed, and because he was her child. She had no photographs of herself taken since her marriage, and that was 10 years before. She wanted her son to know what she looked like at the end. He could not forget her then, not forget utterly. She knew that if she called her maid and told her she wanted to get up, the maid would prevent her, and perhaps send for the doctor, and she had not the strength now to struggle or argue. She got out of bed and began to dress herself. She had been on her back so long that her legs gave way beneath her, and then the soles of her feet tingled so that she could hardly bear to put them to the ground. But she went on. She was unused to doing her own hair, and when she raised her arms and began to brush it, she felt faint. She could never do it as her maid did. It was beautiful hair, very fine, and of a deep, rich gold. Her eyebrows were straight and dark. She put on a black skirt, but chose the bodice of the evening dress which she liked best. It was of a white damask, which was fashionable in those days. She looked at herself in the glass. Her face was very pale, but her skin was clear. She had never had much color, and this had always made the redness of her beautiful mouth emphatic. She could not restrain a sob. But she could not afford to be sorry for herself. She was feeling already desperately tired, and she put on the furs which Henry had given her the Christmas before. She had been so proud of them and so happy then, and slipped downstairs with beating heart. She got safely out of the house and drove to a photographer. She paid for a dozen photographs. She was obliged to ask for a glass of water in the middle of the sitting, and the assistant, seeing she was ill, suggested that she come another day, but she insisted on staying till the end. At last it was finished, and she drove back again to the dingy little house in Kensington, which she hated with all her heart. It was a horrible house to die in. She found the front door open, and when she drove up, the maid and Emma ran down the steps to help her. They had been frightened when they found her room empty. At first they thought she must have gone to Miss Watkin, and the cook was sent round. Miss Watkin came back with her and was waiting anxiously in the drawing-room. She came downstairs now, full of anxiety and reproaches. But the exertion had been more than Mrs. Carey was fit for, and when the occasion for firmness no longer existed, she gave way. She fell heavily into Emma's arms and was carried upstairs. She remained unconscious for a time that seemed incredibly long to those that watched her, and the doctor, hurriedly sent for, did not come. It was next day, when she was a little better, that Miss Watkin got some explanation out of her. Philip was playing on the floor of his mother's bedroom, and neither of the ladies paid attention to him. He only understood vaguely what they were talking about, and he could not have said why those words remained in his memory. "I wanted the boy to have something to remember me by when he grows up." "I can't make out why she ordered a dozen," said Mr. Carey. "2 would have done." Chapter 6. One day was very like another at the vicarage. Soon after breakfast Mary Ann brought in the Times. Mr. Carey shared it with 2 neighbours. He had it from 10 till 1, when the gardener took it over to Mr. Ellis at the Limes, with whom it remained till 7. Then it was taken to Miss Brooks at the Manor House, who, since she got it late, had the advantage of keeping it. In summer, Mrs. Carey, when she was making jam, often asked for a copy to cover the pots with. When the vicar settled down to his paper, his wife put on her bonnet and went out to do the shopping. Philip accompanied her. Blackstable was a fishing village. It consisted of a high street in which there were shops, the bank, the doctor's house, and the houses of 2 or 3 coal ship owners. Round the little harbour were shabby streets in which lived fishermen and poor people. But since they went to chapel, they were of no account. When Mrs. Carey passed the dissenting ministers in the street, she stepped over to the other side to avoid meeting them. But if there was not time for this, she fixed her eyes on the pavement. It was a scandal to which the vicar had never resigned himself that there were 3 chapels in the High Street. He could not help feeling that the law should have stepped in to prevent their erection. Shopping in Blackstable was not a simple matter, for dissent, helped by the fact that the parish church was 2 miles from town, was very common, and it was necessary to deal only with churchgoers. Mrs. Carey knew perfectly that the vicarage custom might make all the difference to a tradesman's faith. There were 2 butchers who went to church, and they would not understand that the vicar could not deal with both of them at once, nor were they satisfied with this simple plan of going for 6 months to one and for 6 months to the other. The butcher who was not sending meat to the vicarage constantly threatened not to come to church, and the vicar was sometimes obliged to make a threat. It was very wrong of him not to come to church, but if he carried iniquity further and actually went to chapel, then of course, excellent as his meat was, Mrs. Carey would be forced to leave him forever. Mrs. Carey often stopped at the bank to deliver a message to Josiah Graves, the manager, who was choir master, treasurer, and church warden. He was a tall, thin man, with a sallow face and a long nose. His hair was very white, and to Philip he seemed extremely old. He kept the parish accounts, arranged the treats for the choir and the schools. Though there was no organ in the parish church, it was generally considered, in Blackstable, that the choir he led was the best in Kent, and when there was any ceremony, such as a visit from the bishop for confirmation or from the rural dean to preach at the harvest thanksgiving, he made the necessary preparations. But he had no hesitation in doing all manner of things without more than a perfunctory consultation with the vicar. And the vicar, though always ready to be saved trouble, much resented the churchwarden's managing ways. He really seemed to look upon himself as the most important person in the parish. Mr. Carey constantly told his wife that if Josiah Graves did not care, he would give him a good rap over the knuckles one day. But Mrs. Carey advised him to bear with Josiah Graves. He meant well, and it was not his fault if he was not quite a gentleman. The vicar, finding his comfort in the practice of a Christian virtue, exercised forbearance, but he revenged himself by calling the churchwarden Bismarck behind his back. Once there had been a serious quarrel between the pair, and Mrs. Carey still thought of that anxious time with dismay. The Conservative candidate had announced his intention of addressing a meeting at Blackstable, and Josiah Graves, having arranged that it should take place in the Mission Hall, went to Mr. Carey and told him that he hoped he would say a few words. It appeared that the candidate had asked Josiah Graves to take the chair. This was more than Mr. Carey could put up with. He had firm views upon the respect which was due to the cloth, and it was ridiculous for a churchwarden to take the chair at a meeting when the vicar was there. He reminded Josiah Graves that parson meant person, that is, the vicar was the person of the parish. Josiah Graves answered that he was the first to recognize the dignity of the church, but this was a matter of politics, and in his turn he reminded the vicar that their blessed Saviour had enjoined upon them to render upon Caesar the things that were Caesar's. To this Mr. Carey replied that the devil could quote Scripture to his purpose, himself had sole authority over the Mission Hall, and if he were not asked to be chairman, he would refuse the use of it for a political meeting. Josiah Graves told Mr. Carey that he might do as he chose, and for his part he thought the Wesleyan Chapel would be an equally suitable place. Then Mr. Carey said that if Josiah Graves set foot in what was little better than a heathen temple, he was not fit to be churchwarden in a Christian parish. Josiah Graves thereupon resigned all his offices, and that very evening sent to the church for his cassock and surplice. His sister, Miss Graves, who kept house for him, gave up her secretaryship of the maternity club, which provided the pregnant poor with flannel, baby linen, coals, and 5 shillings. Mr. Carey said he was at last master in his own house, but he soon found that he was obliged to see to all sorts of things that he knew nothing about, and Josiah Graves, after the first moment of irritation, discovered that he had lost his chief interest in life. Mrs. Carey and Miss Graves were much distressed by the quarrel. They met after a discreet exchange of letters, and made up their minds to put the matter right. They talked, one to her husband, the other to her brother, from morning till night. And since they were persuading these gentlemen to do what in their hearts they wanted, after 3 weeks of anxiety, a reconciliation was effected. It was to both their interest, but they ascribed it to a common love for their Redeemer. The meeting was held at the Mission Hall, and the doctor was asked to be chairman. Mr. Carey and Josiah Graves both made speeches. When Mrs. Carey had finished her business with the banker, she generally went upstairs to have a little chat with her sister, and while the ladies talked of parish matters, the curate or the new bonnet of Mrs. Wilson — Mr. Wilson was the richest man in Blackstable, he was thought to have at least 500 a year, and he had married his cook. Philip sat demurely in the stiff parlor, used only to receive visitors, and busied himself with the restless movements of goldfish in a bowl. The windows were never opened except to air the room for a few minutes in the morning, and it had a stuffy smell which seemed to Philip to have a mysterious connection with banking. Then Mrs. Carey remembered that she had to go to the grocer, and they continued their way. When the shopping was done they often went down a side street of little houses, mostly of wood, in which fishermen dwelt, and here and there a fisherman sat on his doorstep mending his nets, and nets hung to dry upon the doors, till they came to a small beach shut in on each side by warehouses, but with a view of the sea. Mrs. Carey stood for a few minutes and looked at it. It was turbid and yellow, and who knows what thoughts passed through her mind, while Philip searched for flat stones to play ducks and drakes. Then they walked slowly back. They looked into the post office to get the right time, nodded to Mrs. Wigram, the doctor's wife, who sat at her window sewing, and so got home. Dinner was at 1 o'clock, and on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday it consisted of beef, roast, hashed, and minced, and on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of mutton. On Sunday they ate one of their own chickens. In the afternoon Philip did his lessons. He was taught Latin and mathematics by his uncle, who knew neither, and French and the piano by his aunt. Of French she was ignorant, but she knew the piano well enough to accompany the old-fashioned songs she had sung for 30 years. Uncle William used to tell Philip that when he was a curate his wife had known 12 songs by heart, which she could sing at a moment's notice whenever she was asked. She often sang still when there was a tea-party at the vicarage. There were few people whom the Careys cared to ask there, and their parties consisted always of the curate, Josiah Graves with his sister, Dr. Wigram and his wife. After tea, Miss Graves played one or two of Mendelssohn's songs without words, and Mrs. Carey sang When the Swallows Homeward Fly, or Trot, Trot, My Pony. But the Careys did not give tea parties often. The preparations upset them, and when their guests were gone they felt themselves exhausted. They preferred to have tea by themselves, and after tea they played backgammon. Mrs. Carey arranged that her husband should win because he did not like losing. They had cold supper at 8. It was a scrappy meal because Mary Ann resented getting anything ready after tea, and Mrs. Carey helped to clear away. Mrs. Carey seldom ate more than bread and butter, with a little stewed fruit to follow, but the vicar had a slice of cold meat. Immediately after supper Mrs. Carey rang the bell for prayers, and then Philip went to bed. He rebelled against being undressed by Mary Ann, and after a while succeeded in establishing his right to dress and undress himself. At 9 o'clock Mary Ann brought in the eggs and the plate. Mrs. Carey wrote the date on each egg and put the number down in a book. She then took the plate basket on her arm and went upstairs. Mr. Carey continued to read one of his old books, but as the clock struck 10, he got up, put out the lamps, and followed his wife to bed. When Philip arrived, there was some difficulty in deciding on which evening he should have his bath. It was never easy to get plenty of hot water, since the kitchen boiler did not work, and it was impossible for 2 persons to have a bath on the same day. The only man who had a bathroom in Blackstable was Mr. Wilson, and it was thought ostentatious of him. Mary Ann had her bath in the kitchen on Monday night, because she liked to begin the week clean. Uncle William could not have his on Saturday, because he had a very heavy day before him, and he was always a little tired after a bath, so he had it on Friday. Mrs. Carey had hers on Thursday for the same reason. It looked as though Saturday were naturally indicated for Philip, but Mary Ann said she couldn't keep the fire up on Saturday night, what with all the cooking on Sunday, having to make pastry, and she didn't know what all. She did not feel up to giving the boy his bath on Saturday night, and it was quite clear that he could not bathe himself. Mrs. Carey was shy about bathing a boy, and of course the vicar had his sermon, but the vicar insisted that Philip should be clean and sweet for the Lord's day. Mary Ann said she would rather go than be put upon, and after 18 years she didn't expect to have more work given her, and they might show some consideration, and Philip said he didn't want any one to bathe him, but could very well bathe himself. This settled it. Mary Ann said she was quite sure he wouldn't bathe himself properly, and rather than he should go dirty, and not because he was going into the presence of the Lord, but because she couldn't abide a boy who wasn't properly washed, she'd work herself to the bone, even if it was Saturday night. End of chapter 6. Recording by